Welcome. Happy Friday. Good morning from the West Coast, San Francisco. For those of you outside of the West Coast, it's good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us. We're really glad to have so many of you here to be able to talk about the FSA Credential, SASB's updates related to codification, and really make sure that you get your questions answered. So we will have probably about 30-40 minutes of material to get through. Then we'll be sure to make sure that we have questions, and you can feel free to type questions into the chat box at any time. So for those of you who are only able to join us for a few minutes or part of the program, we will have a recording as well as the slides sent out afterwards, so you can be sure to catch up on anything that you might have missed. So I am Nikolai-Lundy. I'm the Director of Education and Partnerships at SASB, and I've been part of the FSA Credential since the very beginning, and thrilled that we're coming up on 2 years since the first cohort of credential holders was announced at the end of 2016, right before our annual SASB conference, which is happening next week. So for those of you who will be there, we're really looking forward to seeing some of you in person. So let me give you a little bit of an overview on the agenda today. Now, half of you are already in the process of taking the FSA, half of you are not, maybe deciding whether or not to sign up, or you plan to do it in the future. So we'll spend just a few minutes at the very beginning, and not much time, but just a brief overview explaining what the FSA is before we get to the main focus of the presentation, where we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of what has happened with SASB's updates to the standards. This is actually, even though we feel proud that we've been seeing the FSA Credential out and available for 2 years, even longer, it's been 6 years of work getting our standards updated and to the point of codified, finalized standards. So we're going to tell you a little bit about that, what actually changed, because there's certainly a lot of coordination and harmonization with the content of the credential. So after we give you a bit of an overview to codification, we'll then spend a little bit of time talking about how that actually impacts the FSA Credential. And then we've got time for Q&A. We are happy to answer any questions that you have. We can talk about exam prep. We can talk about reasons people sign up, everything in between. And then before we sign off, we want to give you a little bit of a teaser for how we plan to mark the anniversary next week. So here is who I am pleased to be joined with in the room today from SASB. I'll let each of them introduce themselves briefly. You've already heard from me, and so I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who helped bring this all together.
Yeah, hi everyone, this is Alex Davidson. As you can see, I'm the marketing manager here at SASB. I mainly deal with emails that you might get about the FSA and other external communications about some of the services and tools we offer.
And Alex is going to be our question master, so as you type them in, he's going to make sure that we can get to them, or at least as many of them as we can. So turning over to Andreas.
Hi, thanks Nikolai. Hi everyone, this is Andreas. I'm the Education and Partnerships Associate here. I'm sure most of you either know who I am or have interacted with me at some point through the FSA process. So it's great to hear from everyone and excited to show you all of our information today.
Andreas is the voice behind the emails, the FSA of SASB emails that we love getting from folks. So last but not least, let's turn it over to Lynn.
Hi everyone, this is Lynn. I'm a member of the research team at SASB, so part of the team that really looks at developing and the content of the standards. Specifically, I oversee the consumer goods and food and beverage sectors. It's great to be able to join Nikolai, Alex, and Andreas today to share with you more what our team has been looking at in the whole codification process.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit our office, if you're in San Francisco, let us know. We'll be happy to show you our lovely green wall, which is behind all of our photos, and make sure you get to know where it all happened. So before I turn it over to Andreas to give a little bit of an update over the last couple of years, I want to give you a little bit of an update or a brief overview of the FSA Credential for those of you who are not as familiar or haven't started the program. So the FSA Credential was designed to help leaders across companies, investment firms, consulting firms, all get on the same page about sustainability and ESG and where that can have a financial impact. We've been really early on in SASB's existence. It was clear that there's a lot of stakeholders and professionals who have an interest in this area, but the terminology can be different, the concepts can be different, understanding how what a corporate sustainability person is doing might impact the way an IR person communicates about a company's value creation story and how that actually manifests to an analyst's interpretation and understanding of value. It all seemed to be disjointed. And so what we wanted to help bring together was the concepts and information that runs through the entire kind of value chain of ESG information, if you will, from the folks that are responsible for collecting and organizing and reporting the data internally, those who are responsible for reporting it externally, and those who are analyzing and interpreting it. So we hear from analysts and investor stewardship teams that go through the program that they really appreciated having a better understanding of some of the challenges, the complexities of fitting ESG information into the normal financial reporting processes that they're used to. We hear from corporate sustainability people that they get some language and tools and references that they can bring to their IR teams to be able to connect the dots. And we hear from consultants that it really helps them with their help their clients get a sense of where sustainability can impact financial performance, how that might fit into communication to investors. So we really try and support candidates through two study guides. The first is really focused on the principles. How can sustainability information be financially material? What are the implications for companies and investors? It's really like taking all the mosaic of puzzle pieces and fitting them all together and walking you through a little bit of historical context, which I think everybody, when they hear there's going to be some history, they kind of groan. And then I'm amazed at how often we hear from folks afterwards that they found it really interesting, compelling. They kind of see the arc of trends over a longer period of time than just a few months or a year or two. So that's really what level one does. Level two tries to give you practical examples. It pulls together miniature case studies, both kind of quasi-realistic based on data that's happened in the marketplace but has been anonymized, or more conceptual examples of how a company's performance on sustainability factors that impact financial performance can ultimately have an influence in understanding a company's value, the company's position for growth or potential risk. So it really tries to take the concepts covered in level one and carry them through to realization and examples and application. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the FSA Credential. And for those who might be wondering, the FSA stands for Fundamentals of Sustainability Accounting. At the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, you can imagine that that's what we're all about. So that's the brief overview that I promised. I didn't want to spend too much time for those who are already well-versed, but we also knew there were many who this was new. So that's about it from me. I'm going to turn it over to Andreas, and he can walk through what's been happening over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Nikolai. So I'm really excited to share this chart with everyone. This is the growth of FSA Level 1 registration over the past 3 years. So you can see a strong trend, and we're growing. You can also see that Q4, even though it's not over yet, has been the highest quarter we've had. And I did want to note that it has been 2 years, this is the anniversary, since our first credential holder, but level 1 registrations did occur before that. And so another slide I wanted to go over was high-level statistics of our FSA program. And so you can see as of this week, we've had 815 level 1 registrations of all time. Level 2, we've had 316 registrations, and we've had 240 FSA credential holders. So these are candidates who have gone through both level 1 and level 2 in the past. The top job functions of the credential holders are consultants, investors, and people who work with sustainability within a company. And so you can also see here our infographic on the right-hand side that goes over some other statistics that you may find interesting. And we're going to be passing these slides out later, so you can always come back and reference that. For now, I'm going to pass it off to Lynn, who's going to talk more about codification and the work that we've done on the standards.
Great. Thank you, Andreas. This is Lynn, and as I mentioned, I'm part of the research team at SASB, where we take a look at our whole standards development process to really arrive at the final contents of the SASB standards. This slide may be familiar to those of you who've been with SASB for a while, but did want to take a minute to just share with those who are a little bit newer to SASB the overarching research standards development process that we take at SASB to develop all of our standards. Everything really begins with industry research by our team to identify topics within each industry that may have financial impact. And then we go out to the market and engage with investors, companies, as well as other subject matter experts to understand how the market looks at it and to identify the evidence of financial impact around these topics. And it's through this process, both internally on our research team as well as active engagement with our standards board, that we arrive at the final content as well as revisions to our standards. So for in these last 3 years we've taken the provisional standards that we had developed at SASB between 2012 and 2016 to really look at it with another critical lens to make sure that the content in there does reflect decision useful information for investors that are based on financial impact. There are also areas that companies, it's cost effective for companies to report on. So over these last 3 years, from 2016 to Q4 of this year, as you can see on this slide, we've engaged with over 141 companies through consultations, as well as reviewed 120 comment letters submitted to us, which reflected over 1,500 different comments to arrive at a final cumulative 429 revisions for incorporation into our codified standards. And we're really excited to share that the codified standards have been published just recently. In this month, we were able to kick this off on November 7th and have it go live, in addition with a launch at the London Stock Exchange, bell ring, as you can see on the bottom right of the slide. And additionally, just earlier this week on Monday, we were able to announce this publicly also at NASDAQ in the United States to share the release of our codified standards. And really, this has been a huge milestone for our organization to reach here, building 6 years of revisions and public input. So maybe now that you see we have codified standards, you're wondering, I'm familiar with looking at some of the provisional standards, what SASB has released before, what has actually changed? So we step back for 1 second. When we look at the public comments, there were really 2 high-level themes that we received. When you look at different stakeholders from companies, often we were getting feedback to reduce the number of quantitative metrics in our standards to reduce reporting burden, and also include more qualitative, so discussion and analysis type metrics, because they felt that then they can provide more of the context and scenario around their different actions and strategies within their business operations. On the contrary, though, usually we hear from investors for more of the quantitative metrics. That way they can do more of a comparability across companies and industry, as well as, build into their analysis. So for us, when we look at the entire standards development process, really it's always a balance of these 2 groups, because we want our standards to be useful for the investors, but also absolutely understand that this needs to be a cost-effective process for companies. And second, another theme we did see is that we heard a lot from companies and industry associations in our public comments, and that's a great thing for us to see, as these are ultimately also the preparers of disclosures, and so to be able to have their voice as well as combined with the investor's voice in the room has really helped to build some of the revisions in our standards. And then on the slide, you can see a couple tables just highlighting, what types of changes have occurred from our provisional to codified standards. I just wanted to highlight here probably three main kind of items that might jump out at you by looking at the numbers. First is you can see within our provisional topics in the top table, as well as in the metrics in the lower table, there were quite a high percentage where you see it's a topic wording that was revised or a metric wording that was improved. These are reflecting what the research team looked at to believe these are revisions that can improve the clarity as well as the accuracy of what is within the provisional standards. So these don't necessarily affect the output per se of the metrics themselves, but we believe for the users of the standards, should improve the usage and the clarity. And second, you can see in the top table, there's also 16% of topics where there were topic splits. And this is something I'll go into a little bit later, is that this is to improve alignment with our general issue categories and different sustainability dimensions, essentially how we map our industries to our classification system. So do want to note that, again, not too much content change, but more improving clarity and aligning with how we organize our standards and disclosure topics. And finally, in general, you can see this, there is a lot of these, as mentioned, is just driven by what I mentioned above in themes around balance of cost effectiveness as well for companies to report versus investors getting that data. But overall, if you look at the total new topics and metrics that are added versus those that were removed, especially down at the metric level, you can see that there was more removed than new metrics that were added. So 11% of metric removals versus 6% of new metrics being added. So in net total, this is reducing the number of metrics in our standards. And we really believe this is taking out some of those metrics that may have been asking for, somewhat similar disclosures, or, in general, helping to reduce the amount of reporting and helping to answer that, asked by companies for us to create a cost-effective standard that they can use. And on the next slide, just to put kind of these numbers, some of these conceptual ideas into concrete examples, I brought out a couple from the food and beverage sector that I work in very closely on to just show you what types of changes we're talking about. First, on the left side you can see that we updated the scope of our agricultural products industry standard to actually exclude on-farm operations from definition within what we would consider businesses directly in that industry. This was based on a lot of input from investors as well as confirmation with companies that this is generally how you see that industry work, where farms are mostly considered to be supply chain, and suppliers of the agricultural products companies. And so it's with that, one definition change actually drove several topic removals as well as metrics from former disclosure topics, let's say in land management, now to shift those metrics into a supply chain topic. So you can see sometimes our revisions at a topic or metric level were driven by kind of a higher level conceptual change. On the other hand, sometimes they are just based on what we're seeing in changes in the market and their direct revisions to metrics. So on the right-hand side, I wanted to highlight that we had a few metrics across several food and beverage sector industries around antibiotic usage in the animal production in that supply chain. And just based on how the market has been changing around this issue in terms of more stringent regulation and a general push to reduce usage of that due to public health concerns, we've also updated our metrics to reflect the contemporary kind of language that's used and the general approaches that we're seeing companies commit to. So you can see these are really kind of two different ends of type of revision, something sometimes driven by something larger and also other times to improve the accuracy and keep up with the market changes. And all of our revisions for all of our 77 different industries, you can see the rationale that our team has taken in the basis for conclusions documents that are available on the SASB website. I think these, especially if it's an industry or a certain area you're interested in, is very interesting. I would recommend taking a look at to just see the thinking as well as the input that drove the changes for our team. Now, in addition to our standards themselves, I did want to take a second on the next few slides to just highlight some of the other changes you might be seeing as you're perusing through the SASB websites and going through our content. First is that we did do a quick update to our Sustainable Industry Classification System, or SIX, which is really kind of our behind-the-scenes mapping of our different industries and sectors based on their shared sustainability issues and topics. So first, just at a high level, you may notice that there are 3 sectors where we updated the sector name. Our former consumption sectors are now updated to food and beverage and consumer goods, just to more easily reflect what the actual industries are within those sectors. Additionally, non-renewable resources has been updated to extractives and minerals processing for very much the same goal to improve clarity. And when we go down to the industry level, we did some similar industry name updates, again, to improve the clarity, and any user of the standard can tell easily what that industry is discussing and talking about. So an example is solar energy was updated to solar technology and project developers to better reflect the scope of that industry. And finally, a few of our industries were also updated in terms of their mapping from which provisional sectors that they were categorized to where now they are in the codified sector. So an example would be restaurants that used to be part of our services sector provisional standards that has now been moved over to food and beverage sector. And really all of these industry mapping updates is based on analysis when we look at the sustainability issues within that industry, which other industries does it align with more, and moving that to the appropriate sector. And finally, we know a lot of you may know SASB really well through also the materiality map. So I'd like to highlight some of the updates that we've also made on the materiality map to really clean up and improve what was already there. So on our website, you can also right now access our new and updated materiality map as well. Again, there are 3 kind of main areas that drove updates that you may see here. First is when we look at the general issue categories, as you see on the slide. So these are kind of what we would call the different sustainability-related business issues that pertain to different industries and companies. For some of these general issue categories, before it really felt like the boundaries were a little bit fuzzy. If we look at fuel management as an example, depending on company operations, fuel management can be a scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions related issue. So on the other hand, sometimes fuel management, it becomes a scope 2 issue for other business operations. And we already have categories on greenhouse gas emissions, which focus on scope 1, and energy management that focuses on scope 2. So really to mitigate the confusion and perhaps confusion on what scope, fuel management refers to, we've eliminated that category, and instead the respective metrics have been mapped to their appropriate, greenhouse gas emissions or energy management categories. And secondly, there were also other general issue categories when we looked at it, they seem pretty similar and might not be super clear on where the distinction lies between the different categories. An example, if you look down on the first column, down at business model innovation within their product packaging versus product design lifecycle inclusion, when we look at the issues, often companies are looking at these sort of cohesively. So again, this is one where we merged in metrics and that used to be, and topics that used to be part of product packaging into the category of product design and lifecycle inclusion. And finally, you'll see a few different categories highlighted in yellow. These ones were, when we looked at the issues, we have moved them to from their current sustainability dimensions that are mapped to others, just when we look at the issues that better map to our definition there. And
before we go on, it looks like we've got a couple questions related to this specific slide. So many of the questions that people have asked we'll address more at the end. But while this is fresh, let's maybe get to one of these. So one question is there a hospitality industry in looking at the change that you said to cruise lines, where it goes from services to transportation? Seems like that's more of a, in this case, in this word, like pleasure experience and transport. So how does hospitality get reflected in the industries?
Yeah, sure. So within our services sector, we do have the hotels and lodging industry, and then also we have leisure facilities, and I believe amusement parks. So for those different hospitality related industries, those are still within services. I believe the shift of cruise lines specifically from services over to transportation is when we, from our research as well as looking at investor and company feedback, the financially material issues in that industry really were coming down to some of the shared sustainability issues that we see in some of the other transportation industries. So within transportation, we also have the different marine transport. So again, boat, vessel, ship related, but for commercial shipping versus in cruise lines for human aspects. But however, within definitely cruise lines in those industries, you will still find, I think, topics that are material that are more specific to that hospitality side of the industry. I hope that answers the question.
Great. And one question related to what you talked about here came up, which is looking at the fact that compensation and benefits is crossed out. Where does that live now? Is it under labor practices?
Yes, the compensation and benefits, as well as when we look at labor relations, the other ones crossed out. We really kind of took a look at that, and that's submerged all under labor practices as different topics under that category.
Great. So those were just very top of mind that as we were going through this, I wanted to make sure we cover. So let's just take one more look at some of the changes you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, so with the materiality map on the last slide, we've been looking at it from what we label as the general issue category. And really it's within each of these categories, then we have the respective disclosure topics. So linking back to that last question kind of on compensation and benefits, within different industries, the specific disclosure topics for that category may be more centered around different elements. But one other high-level change I want to highlight around the materiality map is when we did look at our disclosure topics, especially from some of our earlier developed provisional standards, there were topics that had different kind of dimensions into it mapped to one of these categories. So if you look at the healthcare delivery column on the very right, we had an energy and waste efficiency topic that was mapped to energy. But clearly that, when you look at the metrics within that topic, there were more like, physical kind of concrete waste type of metrics that's not just around energy. So this time around, when we updated the materiality map, any of these hybrid topics, we went ahead and split it into distinct topics, and so they can map clearly to these different sustainability categories that we see. So hopefully we believe for the users that should be a little bit clearer and reduce any confusion on why, energy, water, and waste might be all together in one topic. So we today really have been highlighting, looking back what SASB's been working on the last 3 years, and really I think culmination of all 6 years of us developing the standards. You might be wondering, what does the SASB standards look like going forward? We recognize ESG issues, market continues to evolve, so in the same way our standards will also need to be revised and stay up to date with what we see on the market. So our plan is to continue with a multi-year revision cycle of our standards to provide the necessary updates to reflect what we see in the market. So these, and then within these more larger revisions, there might be smaller edits that you may see in the standards that may reflect improved clarity or improved definitions. But all of these will follow the same process that we discussed earlier in terms of the standards development flow that we take at SASB, and so up to the same rigors in terms of public input as well as research. And we would see that at some of these larger revisions, definitely the FSA exam as well as study guide may be reflected, of course, with the most recent standards. So at this point, I'll wrap up kind of on what we've been looking at in terms of standards development in the codification process. I'll turn it back to Andreas to really link it back to, what does this mean for the FSA exam and the credential holders.
Great, thank you, Lynn. So as Lynn mentioned, all of this work that the team has done with updating the standards now needs to be reflected in the FSA. So this update will encompass identifying changes two parts of the standards within each study guide and exam. The planning process has begun for this project, and we look to finalize and publish in Q1 2019. So we'll implement changes where provisional content is being displayed in the study guides and exams. This includes text and contextual changes. I do want to note that these changes will not affect anyone's performance on the exam, and I'm going to go through a bunch of examples to make sure that it's understood what these changes are. And so this is a list of 4 of the changes. The first is standards content changes, and this is what I was explaining a little bit in the last slide, but part of a SASB standard, so it could be a sector, industry, topic, or metric, is changing, either renamed, added, or removed. So we'll need to identify that in the study guides and exams and then update it. The second type of change is content changes with an example. As for some of you who have gone through the study guides, you're well aware that they reference content in the standards and examples such as case studies or sample questions. So we'll need to go in there and update any content that's exemplifying the standards. The third type is a rationale change. So an explanation of why standards content is the way it is. So for example, throughout the study guide, sometimes we see a certain topic was likely to be material because we'll need to make sure that codification changes have not changed that rationale. And if it has, we'll update it. And lastly, sample questions content. I know a lot of candidates who study for the FSA Credential love looking at the sample questions, and so we want to make sure that the sample questions are updated to reflect the codified standards. And so following, I'll provide examples, actual excerpts from the study guides of where these changes will occur. And so you can see here in the FSA Level 1 study guide, there's an excerpt that refers to the pharmaceuticals industry. This industry is merged with biotechnology industry, so we'll need to go in there and update that to say biotechnology and pharmaceuticals industry. It's a pretty self-explanatory example, but I do have another example of Level 2 study guide. It's the same type of change, just a content change, where we have the metals and mining industry chart. You'll see a non-renewable resources sector. This has actually been changed to extractive and mineral processing sector. So we'll need to go and update that, as well as the first two accounting metrics. They have been revised, so we'll go in and revise those as well. So moving on to the next type of change is an example. In the FSA Level 2 study guide, there's a test your understanding section that highlights the safety and environmental stewardship of chemicals and genetically modified organisms. This provisional topic has been split into 2, so we'll have safety and environmental stewardship of chemicals and genetically modified organisms separately. So we'll need to go into this test your understanding section and either break it out into 2 different sections or eliminate one of those because they're now 2 separate topics. Moving on to the third type of change was the rationale for standards content. Again, in the FSA Level 2 study guide, we see verbiage or a paragraph referring to energy feedstock management disclosure topic. So this topic, within this topic, feedstocks were actually removed from the scope of the topic, and it now focuses on total energy. So we'll need to update the chart and the verbiage throughout the paragraph to reflect this type of change. Lastly, for the sample questions, throughout the study guides, we'll see how, for example, here, labor relations is referred to in the oil and gas services industry. This disclosure topic is no longer associated with the oil and gas services industry, so we'll have to build an entirely new question. It'll be similar, but a new question will have to be written. And again, another note, I just wanted to mention this. I know I mentioned it earlier, but these changes will not affect performance on the exam. Candidates are never required to memorize standards content. For example, what are the disclosure topics related to, or that pertain to the oil and gas services industry? The questions are always referring to standards content in a contextual sense. And so those are all of the types of changes in the project scope that we'll be going through in the next few months. So I have a few, there's been a bunch of questions, Andreas, this is Alex, about
basically the theme that you just mentioned. So one listener was asking about being responsible on the changes that occurred since the publication of the FSA study guide. Like, did we have to know specifically those changes that you went through? And I know you basically just answered that question, but would you just run through it again?
Yeah. So those changes won't need to be memorized, or you won't have to remember what disclosure topics, what sectors, what industries have changed, what are their codified versions. We're just simply going to go in and replace them, and then replace or update any content within the study guide that refers to those changes.
And I think that what Andreas just, this is Nikolai, what Andreas just said a moment ago really brings this home. The exam is not a memorization of what's the name of a SASB industry, what topic is in this industry or not in the other industry. You can always, anytime, look up the topics, look up the industries, look up the metrics. It's really not going to be helpful for you as a candidate if you just have to memorize. The idea behind the exam is to really get people on the same page about the concepts, the language, the relationship to sustainability, materiality, financial performance. So we use the standards as examples, as ways to make the concepts come alive, but they're never what you're actually tested on. What you're tested on is, do you understand the concepts, and can you apply the concepts to a novel situation, showing that you've really mastered learning, so that it reflects kind of the increasing levels of expertise in very standardized learning and curriculum design. So that hopefully helps put many people at ease that we're updating the study guide so that it's current, so that it's not dated, and it's not referring to information that's in the past. But frankly, because the exam isn't trying to say which industry is currently in the SASB standards, it shouldn't have any impact on whether or not you're able to take the exam tomorrow or 4 months from now. You know, we may replace non-renewable resources with extractives and mineral processing, but it's not going to change the concepts that are actually tested.
Yeah, and this is Alex. To that point, we had one credential holder ask if they need to retake the test. Now that they're a current credential holder, will they need to go back and redo it?
That's a great question. So credential holders will not need to go back and retake the exams or do anything of the sort. It's really if you would like the study guides to just see and understand the content changes, we're welcome to send that out, but you're not required to do anything else for codification.
And then another question is will this updated study guide be available for those current credential holders if they want to take a look and just map out those changes?
Of course, yeah, we'll provide the codified version, or excuse me, any of the updates that happen, we'll provide the updated version of that study guide to all credential holders.
Okay.
And this is Lynn, just adding in, if anyone is interested in seeing, again, what exact changes took place between the provisional standard to a codified standard for a certain industry. Again, I'll direct you to the basis for conclusion documents that you can find on our website when you choose an industry standard to download. All of those include at the end also an appendix that highlights at high level, just a quick glance what changed from the last provisional version to the current one.
Yeah, it's basically a track changes version of the topics and metrics for the different industries. So we've actually had a couple questions come in related to seeing those changes. So what we can do when we send out the slides and the recording is also include a link to the basis for conclusion. Well, the page where you can download those alongside the standards. We're getting lots of questions, and I think that it'll be tough for just Alex to process all of those. So what we may do is Alex and I may go one after another asking questions. So we're glad to see that you are so engaged, and so we just want to make sure we can get to those. So I'll turn it over to Alex for this next one, and then I'll pose the one after that.
Yeah, there's just been a lot of questions about how kind of SASB compares to other organizations that are putting out frameworks. This is a very general question around ESG reporting. So then I don't know if you want to talk about kind of how SASB relates to others, and then there's also been questions about harmonization. So if we could kind of address that as well.
Great. Those are great questions, and we definitely hear that a lot, especially from those that work, within sustainability and in companies on how do I balance really right now this whole alphabet soup of different, ESG sustainability related reporting frameworks. So common ones that some of you on the phone may be thinking of are GRI, CDP, SASB's there, and then also, there's more work around like integrated reporting, and then those are more specific around climate, the TCFD. So first of all, as all of our organizations, we recognize that there is a lot of different frameworks out there, and there's limited resources and time for companies to report on these issues. For SASB, we see our standards as complementary to the other standards, and I think in general that's the approach all of us see that. And specifically, the SASB standards really focus on the disclosure topics that are financially material and are targeted for investor use. So the data that companies disclose is really the ones we believe that are what the investors would be most interested in looking at and in using to kind of make their financial investment decisions and analyzing the companies. So when we think of the framework of all different disclosure topics, especially when we're talking about the materiality map, you can easily think every single one of those categories a company could be asked to disclose on. For SASB, we identify that subset that have been backed by research and evidence of their financial performance impact. In terms of the second part of the question related to harmonization, there is active dialogue right now between all the different reporting frameworks, the Corporate Reporting Dialogue Initiative that's organized by the Integrated Reporting Council. So all of the organizations kicked off recently. It will be an active dialogue on really how to align different metrics within the different reporting frameworks to each other. Also, just conversations really to answer that harmonization question. So a lot of work actively going on kind of behind the scenes on that. And yeah.
And just to reiterate or emphasize what Lynn was saying there, it's about aligning metrics. Mm-hmm. There's been some questions about, does this mean that there's just going to be some big, aggregation that there's only ever one, that in the future this effort is designed to create only one set of standards? And that's really not the purpose. Because you can't have one set of standards that serves a range of different purposes and is useful for everybody. SASB standards are designed to help investor decision-making, financially motivated users. There's a whole audience of stakeholders that care about information that is not strictly tied to financial performance. Employees thinking about where they want to work, customers thinking about the types of companies they want to support, companies thinking about what suppliers they want to purchase from. And so there are other standards and frameworks and guidance that can support a range of different information sources. So we've been doing a lot of work with GRI, hosting public events over the past year, co-writing articles and hosting forums for companies to really understand that it's not a one versus the other. They can serve different purposes, different audiences, but what we know is that, let's say that GRI or CDP or other standards that have metrics, as opposed to just guidance, the integrated reporting framework doesn't actually have metrics, so there's less to align there. But when you get to metrics for like GRI standards, GRI might have a particular metric about biodiversity impact that is really, really, really similar, but not the same to a SASB metric. Is there a reason for that difference? Does it help meet different user needs, or can they actually be aligned so that a company using both standards doesn't have to compile data for two slightly different metrics when they can maybe do it for the same? So that's really the initiative that's underway. And then there was a question about how does this all impact the FSA credential? It's really a concept that Andreas outlined, which is that the FSA credential is about concepts for sustainability accounting and materiality and sustainability and the scope of information, and we use the standards as examples. And so, and the case studies and other things are all examples. So if metrics change in the standards, we'll update the examples in the study guide to really drive that home.
And this is Alex again. Just to hammer this point home, there was just a question that popped up about should people wait for the revised study guide to be released to sign up? Andreas, you've talked about this, but I really want to make sure that people on the call understand that taking the test is essentially taking the test, regardless of study guide.
Yeah, and just to further clarify, we want our candidates to take the exam whenever they feel ready for it, but there's no need to wait until the revised study guides, because just as you said, there's no content in there that you need to wait for. So the timeline's really still your own, and the only thing we're updating are the small changes that we referred to earlier.
And on a related note, we've got a couple of questions from either people who are in the process of taking the FSA or thinking about it. Two parts. One is, other than the study guide, are there some other ways that they can prepare for the exam? And then once people get the credential, what community out there is there for them to join to either share best practices or learn from each other?
Yeah, so those are great questions. Sorry, repeat the first question again.
Test taking tips for the beginning, for those at the beginning of the process, and then for once they finish it, what kind of community building is there?
Yeah, so the exam is intended, the only material needed to prepare for the exam were the study guides. For FSA Level 1, there is a service that offers an online course. It's called Bench Prep. You can find that on our website. But besides that, really the only thing needed to prepare for the exam are the FSA study guides.
Which include the sample questions.
Right. And there's also, so the sample questions can be downloaded on the website, but they're also provided at the end of the study guides.
And then so once someone passes level 1 and 2, and if they're looking for community or networking, this person referenced a LinkedIn group. Will that be activated in any way, or are there some other leadership groups that are forming to kind of galvanize this community?
Yeah, great question. So as you mentioned, we do have the LinkedIn group, which you're invited to, or you ask for an invite after passing the level 1 exam. And we always recommend fostering community and conversation on that LinkedIn page around SASB, around ESG issues, or anything of the sort. We are currently working on fostering community around the FSA community. So if individuals are interested in that, they can feel free to email fsa@sasb.org, and I can, because we're still planning for that, we can introduce the conversation to them as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I'm just combing through these questions.
There's a question here about would reporting on how climate change might impact the company as recommended by the TCFD be covered by the greenhouse gas emissions topic? And I've worked closely over the last few weeks with our TCFD expert in preparing some materials for others. So I am not the expert, but I will channel them. So in thinking about TCFD, and we've been asked to clarify acronyms like GRI, which we clarified on the Q&A platform. But TCFD is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's a task force formed by the G20, looking at improving climate disclosure in mainstream financial reporting. So the TCFD guidelines and recommendations include recommendations for governance of climate, the strategy for climate, the risk management for climate, and metrics and targets. So SASB actually fits very clearly into the metrics and targets. We're very heavily cited in terms of metrics and targets that the TCFD can use, but interestingly also into other components like strategy and risk management, because we have, for some of our metrics, qualitative discussions around what's the company's strategy for thinking about changing scenarios for carbon prices or climate mitigation and adaptation. So greenhouse gas emissions is really only appearing in a handful of industries where it's really shown to be financially material to that industry. It does not appear in plenty of other industries. It does not appear in media and entertainment. It does not appear in advertising and marketing. There's a range of different industries where greenhouse gas emissions does not surface, but there are other ways in which the climate impacts that are surfaced in TCFD's recommendations are manifested in the SASB standards and really well aligned with the TCFD recommendations. We did a webinar on this yesterday. We are doing a presentation at our conference next week, and we have a couple guides that we've co-written with CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, on our website, which can provide much more detailed guidance. But just for one more example, if you think about automobile companies, automobile companies do not actually emit a lot of Scope 1 emissions when you think about the cars that they manufacture. But so we don't have the emissions from the cars that they manufacture, because that happens in the use phase. But what we do have is how is the company designing their automobiles for fuel efficiency and emissions standards. And so that actually goes into a SASB standard thinking about product design and life cycle management. So the way in which climate can impact companies is not just through greenhouse gas emissions. It can actually materialize in a range of different ways in which the company business model operates. And so TCFD overlap fits across many of the categories and topics in the standard. So hopefully that provides a little bit of an overview, because we know we get that question a lot, and is something that we, in the update to the standards, have become even more aligned with the TCFD than we were with the provisional.
Lynn, we got a question about standards updates, and the question was about how often that cycle will occur. So you laid out the codification process that we just went through, and going forward, what does that look like?
Sure. For our ongoing standards development process, we are currently looking at a multi-year cycle. So in terms of potentially more larger updates, and in no way, I think, do we anticipate this being at the same scope that you have seen between what we talked about today, from provisional to codified standards. I think this will be, certain topics or specific metrics that we need to, provide an update as appropriate, but definitely in no way in terms of on a large scale. So I don't have an exact date, I think, at this point, in terms of when we would anticipate seeing this next revision. This is an active conversation that our research team, as well as our standards boards, is kind of mapping out right now. So I would recommend really is stay tuned, but definitely we don't anticipate this, in the near future, and we'll see this more as a kind of multi-year kind of cadence.
Thank you. So I think I'm just going to quickly talk about, we've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to quickly do the slide I need to talk about, and then if we have time, we can address 1 or 2 more questions. I'll try to get through this, but I want to get everyone while they're still on the call. So on Friday, December 7th, as Nikolai mentioned and Andreas mentioned, the first cohort, this is essentially the 2-year anniversary of the first cohort of FSA credential holders, and we want to celebrate that. So we highlighted some examples of ways that people have shown their enthusiasm for the FSA and shown that they're current credential holders, both on LinkedIn and Twitter. What we're going to be pushing out to you all are some of those assets that you can, either as a current credential holder or someone who's supportive of the FSA community, can share across social media, not only to kind of raise awareness of the hard work that you put into it or the work that you do every day, but also just to show the breadth and depth of the FSA credential. So we, like I said, we'll be pushing out social media posts. We'll be using the FSA credential hashtag, and we wanted to just show you at least these 2 examples of folks, both who on a personal level and on a corporate level have shared out their FSA credential status.
Which we think the fact that we're going to try and support on an organized day social media activity should also help with folks in the community finding each other by tracking what else is happening. So it's an experiment, and happy to hear anybody's feedback as it plays out.
Yeah, it would be great to use this as kind of a jumping off point for that community building question we got earlier, and really enable you folks to connect and encourage us to continue our convening role, but sometimes it helps if we connect the dots between you all.
So we have time for maybe one or two more questions. There's one here that has actually 3 questions in one, but I think that it's timely and relevant to really looking ahead to the future. So do you think more companies will be putting their SASB metrics in their 10Ks now that the standards are final as opposed to standalone CSR reports? So I can chime in and let my colleagues join as well. So, you know, in SASB's founding, we really were very focused on encouraging and advocating for disclosure in 10Ks for 2 reasons. One, it was an existing reporting channel that companies were already leveraging. We really didn't want to try and create something separate and outside of that, but really support integration into what companies were already doing. But also it allowed us to keep a relatively clear focus without trying to support every possible market and jurisdiction in the world. We were able to keep a focus when we were still a new and young nonprofit. So what we've learned, though, is that the quality of reporting is really more important to investors than the location. They're not really that concerned at this point about the 10K. Now, when they see it in the 10K, they have more confidence, they appreciate it, they don't have as much skepticism, but they're interested in the data today. And they know that there's a range of different challenges with companies going from not having it in the 10K to having it in the 10K, you know, within a matter of months. And we won't go into all those challenges. So the way in which we're trying to support the market is to say that we are still focused on financial materiality. We're still focused on decision usefulness and standardized comparable data. But what we're not saying is that this is where companies have to communicate to their investors. It's going to be up to a company to decide what's the best channel for them to communicate this. In course, being mindful of the fact that over time, there is likely to be more and more practice of including it in the 10K, including some of the companies that have already done that, particularly in the real estate industry. So that maybe gives a little bit of clarity, but we do think the finalized standards will help. The second question, do you want companies to refer to SASB in their 10Ks if they're going to adopt the standards? You know, it's really, when we see companies using the standards in any public communication, and we see many companies outside the US currently, there's several dozen companies, most of them listed on our website with links to their reports. Whenever we see companies using the standards to report publicly, we just encourage them to use the actual metric codes that are identified in the standards so that it's clear where that information is coming from, what accounting guidance is used in preparing the data, and then is there a network that can help companies looking for ESG reporting help get matched with people who can help them. So SASB is not, SASB is interested in creating a place for people who want to have these conversations, find each other. So we have our membership program, the SASB Alliance, which is still relatively new. It's only a little over a year old, but we've got over 50 members, organizational members, as well as some individual members that are part of conversations in this space. We are not trying to use it as a matchmaking service to say, here's consulting firms or accounting firms or auditing firms or whatever, because we are not trying to overly commercialize or pressure companies. But what we do is we have ongoing conversations, sometimes in person, sometimes remote, about these issues and the materiality of sustainability. So that was a lot of questions, and hopefully was able to give some light to those. And we might need to end there, but does anybody else in the room have anything else to add?
I just wanted, this is Alex, to follow up, and I put this out on chat, but if we weren't able to get to your question, we will reach out to you, or feel free to email me if you don't hear from us. We got a lot of questions this webinar. My email address is alex.davidson, Davidson, sasb.org, and we'll follow up and make sure that your question gets addressed.
Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us.